Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Young and the Restless channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. The storm surrounding Genoa City was growing darker by the hour, and on Wednesday, May 13th, the tension hanging over everyone connected to Matt Clark felt like a fuse burning dangerously close to its end. At the Newman Ranch, the atmosphere was already thick with suspicion when Adam Newman noticed something unsettling about Nick Newman. Just moments earlier, Nick had been agitated, restless, and spiraling under the weight of everything happening around them. But after devouring a sandwich in near silence, his entire demeanor suddenly shifted. The calmness in his eyes didn't reassure Adam, it frightened him. Adam immediately feared the worst, convinced Nick might be using again after everything he had fought through. But Nick brushed the concern aside with a tired smirk and insisted he had simply been hangry. He claimed he was detoxing and trying to regain control, yet there was something colder beneath his words, something calculated and deeply dangerous that Adam could not ignore. As the conversation deepened, Nick finally revealed the truth that had been hardening inside him like stone. He confessed that he had a plan to end Matt Clark's life once and for all, and worse still, he believed he had already figured out a way to escape the consequences. Nick intended to recruit Detective James Burrow and manipulate the situation so Burrow would testify that the killing had happened in self-defense. The chilling certainty in Nick's voice sent alarm bells ringing through Adam's mind. Adam immediately argued that the entire scheme was reckless, desperate, and almost guaranteed to destroy Nick's future. He warned him that one wrong move could land him behind bars for the rest of his life. But Nick was no longer listening to reason. There was a grim determination in him now, the kind born from exhaustion, fear, and the belief that violence was the only remaining answer. Adam could see it clearly. Nick had already crossed an emotional line in his mind, and no amount of pleading seemed capable of pulling him back. Meanwhile, at Sharon Newman's house, another tense strategy session was unfolding as Sharon sat with Victor Newman and Noah Newman, all of them consumed by the growing threat Matt represented. Noah cautiously suggested that maybe Matt's amnesia was genuine, and if that were true, perhaps they could use it to their advantage. He believed there might still be an opportunity to catch Matt off guard with a carefully planned sneak attack before he regained his full memory. Sharon, however, looked exhausted by the endless cycle of danger and retaliation that Matt had brought into their lives. The thought of her loved ones throwing themselves into yet another dangerous scheme filled her with dread. She desperately wanted to protect her family from more bloodshed, more trauma, and more irreversible mistakes. But Victor Newman, as relentless and intimidating as ever, showed little hesitation when it came to striking back at an enemy. Victor backed Noah's instincts completely, making it clear that in his eyes, Matt Clark remained a threat that had to be dealt with before he destroyed more lives. Not long afterward, Victor crossed paths with Adam, and the conversation quickly turned grave. Adam confided his growing fears about Nick, admitting that he believed Nick was unraveling under the pressure. He also revealed Nick's terrifying plan to kill Matt and manipulate Detective Burrow into supporting a self-defense narrative afterward. Victor's expression darkened instantly, even for a man like Victor Newman who had built an empire through ruthless tactics and cold calculations. Nick's plan crossed a dangerous line. Victor understood all too well how quickly desperation could destroy a family, and he had no intention of standing by while Nick marched toward disaster. Adam insisted they had to act immediately and somehow remove Nick from the situation before he did something irreversible. For the first time in a long while, Victor and Adam found themselves aligned by the same fear. Not just fear of Matt Clark, but fear of what Nick himself was becoming. But by the time anyone could intervene, Nick had already moved forward with his mission. When he arrived at the cottage and informed Sharon and Noah about his plan to personally take Matt down, the room instantly filled with panic and disbelief. Nick explained with unwavering certainty that Detective Burrow would back his story afterward and ensure everything appeared legally justified. Sharon's face fell as the horrifying reality settled over her. She begged Nick not to go through with it, terrified that vengeance would destroy him completely, while Noah urgently tried to reason with him before things spiraled beyond repair. Yet Nick stood firm, emotionally barricaded behind his rage and conviction. The pain in his eyes revealed just how deeply Matt had wounded him and everyone around him, and Nick had reached the point where he believed only one ending remained possible. No matter how loudly Sharon and Noah protested, there was simply no changing his mind now. Nick had decided he would lead this fight himself, even if it cost him everything. Across town at Crimson Lights, the tension took on a far stranger and more unpredictable tone when Patty Williams found herself chatting with Matt Clark. Patty rambled endlessly about high school memories and old boyfriends, bouncing chaotically between nostalgia and awkward fascination while Matt listened with confused curiosity. The bizarre encounter took another turn when Phyllis Summers suddenly walked in and immediately sensed something deeply wrong about the situation unfolding before her. Without hesitation, Phyllis shut the conversation down and pushed Patty away, warning Matt in blunt, unmistakable terms that Patty was a psychopath. Matt listened carefully as Phyllis detailed Patty's long history of instability, dangerous behavior, and repeated stays in mental institutions. The weight of Phyllis's warnings lingered heavily in the air, but Matt's confusion only seemed to deepen. Struggling with fragments of memory and identity, he admitted that he had finally pieced together at least one detail. His name was apparently Matt, and he came from Los Angeles. Though he suspected he had spent much of his life constantly moving from place to place, there was something strangely vulnerable about Matt in that moment, as though the missing pieces of his past had left him emotionally untethered. Intrigued by Phyllis and desperate for answers, Matt eventually convinced her to have dinner with him and help him reconstruct the gaps in his memory. Phyllis reluctantly agreed, partly out of curiosity and partly because something about Matt's confusion felt disturbingly genuine. As the conversation continued, Matt casually mentioned a recent encounter with someone named Noah and revealed that Victor Newman's name had also surfaced during his attempts to understand who he was. That instantly sharpened Phyllis's attention. Her instincts kicked in immediately, and with growing suspicion, she asked Matt for his last name. The moment he calmly answered, "Matt Clark," everything seemed to stop around her. A cold realization washed across Phyllis's face as the pieces suddenly snapped together in her mind. The name clearly meant something to her, something dangerous, something explosive, and the shock in her expression hinted that Matt's forgotten past was far more sinister than even he realized. Elsewhere in society, emotions were boiling over in an entirely different kind of conflict. Devin Winters was deeply frustrated as he vented about Kane Ashby's involvement in helping Malcolm Winters. From Devin's perspective, Kane's actions felt painfully self-serving, and he believed it was obvious Kane was only stepping in to score points with Lily Winters. The bitterness in Devin's voice revealed just how emotionally exhausted he had become, and Lily quickly pushed back against his accusations. She argued that Kane's motivations didn't matter if Malcolm's life was ultimately being saved. To Lily, the bigger issue wasn't Kane at all. It was the unresolved anger Devin was carrying over the Mariah Copeland situation. She gently but firmly suggested that Devin was redirecting his pain and frustration onto the wrong people because he still couldn't accept that Mariah had avoided the punishment he believed she deserved. As the emotional conversation stretched on, Devin finally admitted the truth he had been trying to bury beneath his anger. He confessed that he was still consumed by frustration over Mariah escaping real consequences, and the resentment had begun poisoning his perspective on everything around him. Lily listened carefully before encouraging him to visit Mariah at the facility where she was staying. She hoped that seeing Mariah in her current state with his own eyes might help him understand her mental and emotional struggles more clearly. There was compassion in Lily's voice, but also a quiet plea for Devin to stop letting anger define him. Slowly, Devin began to consider the possibility that maybe she was right. The walls around his emotions seemed to crack ever so slightly as he agreed to take a closer look at both Mariah's condition and the darkness growing within himself. And as the storm clouds continued gathering over Genoa City, it became painfully clear that every character was standing dangerously close to a breaking point where vengeance, grief, and desperation could change their lives forever. Night slowly descended over Genoa City like a heavy curtain, wrapping every street, every shadowed window, and every restless soul in a suffocating sense of inevitability. The tension surrounding Matt Clark had evolved beyond fear now. It had become obsession, the kind that infected entire families and pushed even rational people toward dangerous choices. At the cottage, Sharon Newman remained deeply unsettled long after Nick stormed out with his deadly plan still firmly intact. The silence he left behind felt colder than any argument. Sharon stood frozen for several moments, replaying the look in Nick's eyes over and over again. Not just anger, but a frightening calmness that only appeared when someone had already convinced themselves there was no turning back. Noah tried to reassure her that Nick wouldn't truly go through with murder, yet even he struggled to sound convincing. Deep down, both of them knew that Matt Clark had already pushed Nick further emotionally than anyone had realized, and the possibility of tragedy now felt terrifyingly real. Elsewhere, Victor Newman sat alone for a brief moment after speaking with Adam, and even the great Victor Newman appeared weighed down by the growing crisis surrounding his family. For decades, Victor had controlled chaos through power, strategy, and intimidation, but this situation felt far more personal and unpredictable. Nick was not merely acting recklessly, he was unraveling emotionally, allowing vengeance to dictate his decisions instead of reason. Victor understood that once a person convinced themselves that violence was justified, stopping them became infinitely harder. Adam's warnings echoed through Victor's mind, especially the fear that Nick could end up destroying his own life in the process of trying to destroy Matt's. Victor hated feeling powerless when it came to protecting his family, And for perhaps the first time in a long while, he faced a battle that money and influence alone could not easily control. Beneath his cold exterior, there was genuine fear growing inside him. Fear that the Newman family was heading straight toward irreversible disaster. At Crimson Lights, the atmosphere shifted into something strangely intimate and unnerving as Phyllis Summers continued sitting across from Matt Clark, now fully shaken by the revelation of his identity. Though Matt remained calm and oddly vulnerable, Phyllis's mind raced furiously behind her composed expression. She studied him carefully, trying to reconcile the dangerous man she had heard about with the confused stranger now searching desperately for fragments of his memory. The realization that this man, this lost, uncertain figure sitting across from her, was the same Matt Clark connected to so much fear and chaos sent chills through her entire body. Yet there was another layer to the encounter that made things even more complicated. Matt genuinely seemed unaware of the damage he had caused or the enemies he had made. His questions felt sincere, his confusion authentic. And for brief moments, Phyllis almost caught herself feeling sympathy for him before quickly reminding herself how dangerous that could be. Matt, meanwhile, seemed drawn toward Phyllis precisely because she treated him with brutal honesty instead of fear or manipulation. As they continued talking, he admitted that every new clue about his identity felt less like recovery and more like uncovering evidence against himself. He confessed that the reactions people gave him whenever his name surfaced left him deeply unsettled, as though everyone around him already knew he was capable of terrible things. Phyllis listened carefully, but her instincts remained on high alert. She had lived through too many disasters in Genoa City to trust appearances alone, and something about Matt's fragmented vulnerability felt almost too perfect. Still, curiosity pulled her deeper into the mystery despite her better judgment. By the time they agreed to continue their dinner plans, there was a dangerous tension hanging between them, part suspicion, part fascination, and part looming catastrophe waiting to explode the moment Matt regained the wrong memory. Back at Society, Devin Winters found himself emotionally exhausted after his confrontation with Lily and Nate Hastings. The anger he had been carrying for weeks no longer felt sharp and righteous. Instead, it felt heavy, draining, and deeply corrosive. Lily's words about Mariah Copeland lingered painfully in his mind because some part of him knew she was right. His outrage over Mariah avoiding punishment had begun bleeding into every other aspect of his life, twisting his judgment and making him lash out at people who were not truly responsible for his pain. Devin hated admitting vulnerability, especially when he felt betrayed, but Lily's suggestion that he visit Mariah at the facility stirred something unexpected inside him: doubt. What if he had become so consumed by anger that he could no longer see the full truth of what Mariah was going through? The possibility unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. As the evening continued, Lily watched Devin carefully, noticing the subtle shift in his demeanor as his emotional defenses slowly weakened. She knew Devin's heart better than most people did, and despite his frustration and bitterness, she also knew he was someone capable of compassion once he allowed himself to see beyond his hurt. Nate attempted to keep the peace, but even he could sense how emotionally fragile the situation had become. Every conversation in Genoa City now seemed connected by the same invisible thread: grief, vengeance, guilt, and the desperate need for redemption. Whether it was Nick plotting against Matt, Victor trying to protect his family, or Devin wrestling with his anger toward Mariah, everyone seemed trapped inside emotional storms they could barely control. The city itself almost felt haunted by unresolved pain, with every relationship straining under the pressure of secrets and unfinished battles. And through it all, Matt Clark unknowingly remained at the center of the chaos, drifting through Genoa City like a man standing in the ruins of a life he could not fully remember. Each new interaction pulled him closer to truths that others desperately wanted hidden, while simultaneously pushing Nick Newman closer to the edge of violence. The collision course between them now felt unavoidable. Sharon feared it. Adam feared it. Even Victor Newman, a man rarely shaken by anything, feared it. Yet none of them seemed capable of stopping the momentum already building beneath the surface. As darkness settled fully across the city and every character prepared for what came next, one painful reality became impossible to ignore. The moment Matt Clark finally remembered who he truly was might also become the exact moment everything around him shattered beyond repair. The deeper the night grew, the more Genoa City seemed to sink beneath the weight of secrets, fear, and approaching violence. Every quiet hallway, every dimly lit room, and every lonely stretch of road carried the feeling that something catastrophic was waiting just around the corner. At the Newman Ranch, Adam could no longer shake the dread building inside him after Nick's confession. He paced restlessly, replaying every detail of their conversation, every cold promise hidden behind Nick's calm voice. What frightened Adam most was not Nick's anger. The Newman family had survived anger countless times before. It was the terrifying sense of clarity Nick now possessed. This was no emotional outburst or reckless threat spoken in the heat of the moment. Nick had thought everything through, convincing himself that killing Matt Clark was not only necessary, but justified. And once Nick locked onto an idea with that level of determination, Adam knew how difficult it became to stop him. Victor Newman remained equally troubled, though he masked it beneath his usual controlled demeanor. Sitting in silence for a moment inside the ranch, Victor stared into the darkness with the expression of a man calculating outcomes he desperately wanted to avoid. He had spent his life fighting enemies, eliminating threats, and protecting his empire by any means necessary, but this situation struck too close to home. Nick was not acting like himself anymore. The pressure, fear, and emotional exhaustion surrounding Matt Clark had slowly eroded the stable man Victor believed his son to be. Victor understood vengeance better than anyone, yet he also understood its cost. Once blood was spilled, there would be no undoing the damage. Not for Nick, not for Sharon, and not for the entire Newman family already hanging together by fragile emotional threads. For all his power, Victor found himself facing a truth he hated. Sometimes the greatest danger to a family came not from outside enemies, but from the pain festering within their own hearts. Meanwhile, Sharon Newman sat awake at the cottage, unable to escape the storm of fear churning inside her. Noah had tried to reassure her before finally retreating for the night, but Sharon's maternal instincts refused to let her rest. She knew Nick too well. Beneath his protective instincts and fierce loyalty, there had always been a dangerous side to him when someone he loved was threatened. Matt Clark had become more than just a problem to solve. He had become the embodiment of every fear, every betrayal, and every wound Nick could no longer tolerate. Sharon stared out into the darkness, haunted by the possibility that Nick might already be preparing to cross a line that would change his life forever. The thought of losing him emotionally, spiritually, or physically filled her chest with unbearable dread. She had seen too many people destroyed by revenge in Genoa City, and now the man she loved seemed ready to become the next casualty. Across town, the atmosphere around Phyllis Summers and Matt Clark continued growing more emotionally complicated with every passing moment. Sitting together over dinner, the tension between suspicion and vulnerability became almost impossible to separate. Matt remained painfully honest about his confusion, admitting that every new piece of information about himself only deepened his discomfort. He spoke quietly about feeling disconnected from his own identity, as though he were walking through someone else's memories instead of recovering his own. Phyllis watched him carefully, searching for signs of manipulation or deception, but the sincerity in his eyes kept throwing her off balance. For someone supposedly tied to so much danger, Matt carried himself with an almost tragic sense of emptiness. Yet Phyllis knew better than to trust appearances completely. In Genoa City, the most dangerous people were often the ones who looked broken before revealing just how destructive they could truly become. As the conversation continued, Matt mentioned Noah once again and spoke about how strange it felt whenever Victor Newman's name surfaced around him. He admitted that every encounter seemed loaded with hidden tension, as though everyone around him knew a version of himself that he could not access. Phyllis felt her nerves tighten with every word. She understood exactly how explosive the truth surrounding Matt Clark could become, especially if his memories returned suddenly and violently. The realization placed her in an uncomfortable position. Part of her wanted to walk away immediately and warn everyone that Matt was beginning to piece things together. Another part of her, however, remained deeply curious about whether Matt's amnesia had genuinely transformed him into someone different. It was a dangerous curiosity, the kind that often led people into emotional traps they could not escape until it was too late. At the same time, Devin Winters found himself alone with his thoughts after leaving society, and for the first time in days, the anger consuming him began softening into something far more painful: reflection. Lily's words echoed relentlessly in his mind as he considered the possibility of visiting Mariah Copeland at the facility. He hated how much resentment still lived inside him, hated how easily bitterness had begun controlling his reactions. The frustration over Mariah escaping punishment had become a wound he carried everywhere, quietly poisoning his judgment and relationships. Yet beneath all the anger, there was still grief, disappointment, and confusion over how everything had spiraled so badly. Devin slowly began realizing that his rage toward Mariah might not actually be about justice anymore. It might simply be about his inability to process the emotional damage left behind. Elsewhere, Lily remained deeply worried about Devin despite their difficult conversation. She could see how close he was to emotionally isolating himself, allowing anger to harden him into someone colder and more distant than she recognized. Nate shared her concern, understanding that unresolved pain had a way of consuming people from the inside out if left unchecked. In many ways, Devin's struggle mirrored what was happening all across Genoa City. Everyone seemed to be fighting private battles against grief, vengeance, guilt, or fear, and no one knew how much longer those emotional walls could hold before everything collapsed. The city itself felt emotionally exhausted, filled with people desperately trying to maintain control while standing dangerously close to losing it. And looming over all of it was the growing inevitability of a confrontation between Nick Newman and Matt Clark. Like two storms moving steadily toward each other, their collision now felt unavoidable. Nick was preparing himself for violence with chilling certainty, while Matt unknowingly moved closer and closer to recovering the truth about the man he used to be. Sharon feared the consequences, Adam feared them, Victor feared them. Even Phyllis, despite her sharp instincts and hardened exterior, could sense that the situation was spiraling towards something devastating. As the night stretched deeper into silence and uncertainty, one truth became impossible to ignore. Genoa City was standing on the edge of an emotional explosion, and when the first spark finally ignited, no one's life would remain untouched by the fallout.